Hello and welcome to Zer0 Books presents Buddies Without Organs presents The Cave Files. I am Sean and I am joined as ever by Matt.
Hi, Sean.
Corey.
Hey, buddies.
And our inaugural guest. We have with us Robin Mackay.
Hello.
Hello, Robin.
Am I the first guest you've ever had?
The first guest we've ever had, yeah. I didn't realise that until today when I was thinking how I was going to introduce you and realised that all through Buddies Without Organs, we never had a guest. So you are our very first.
Great. Well, I hope that I don't disappoint in that case. I'm quite nervous. I'm not sure why.
Well, the thing is, we have nothing to compare you to. So whatever performance you give us, you're the best guest we've ever had. Exactly.
So far.
You are also the first guest we ever wanted. I remember we actually tried to some behind the scenes gossip. We did want to have you on to talk about chronosis when we did that as part of our listing. Maybe we can talk a bit about that as we go on. But yeah, so it's been, I think we've all been wanting to chat to you for ages. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
No problems.
So this episode is going to take a different format to our last episode where we were discussing a text. We don't have a text. You don't need to do any homework to enjoy this episode. We are just going to be us four buddies having a conversation, basically. We're going to be... I kind of don't want to call it, like, although I suppose it is technically an interview, I also don't want to think of it as one because that just makes it stressful already for everyone involved. This really is just wanting to get you on, Robin, because you are so connected with this world that we've been exploring, and that's really it. Really, we just wanted to get you on so we could have like a good long conversation with you about not only about Mark Fisher but also your own work, your time with CCRU, what you're doing with Urbanomic, and ultimately leading to why, and we don't have an agenda as such, but we do have. I did put together a little list of prompts for myself. We're going to be hopefully leading up to a conversation about By the North Sea, which was a absolutely fascinating work. But we're not going to jump into that right now. We're not going to preempt that because really, what I want to start off with is just asking you to tell us a bit about yourself, Robin. Like for people who might not know who you are, and I'm certain all of our listeners will, could you just introduce yourself to us and just let us know a little bit about who you are, what you do?
Okay, my name's Robin Mackay, and at the moment, the main thing that I do and that I have been doing for the last 15 years or so is running the small publishing house in the UK called Urbanomic. Specialising in contemporary philosophy, some art books, and really more than anything interested in the crossover between contemporary philosophy and other fields, music, art, science, and culture in general. So really trying to maintain a platform outside the academy for philosophical thinking that's serious, but that isn't necessarily following the model of the academic profession of philosophy, which I have been involved in. I mean, I did go to university, I did study philosophy, and I've made 2 attempts at doing a PhD, neither of which I finished. So I have a kind of uneasy relationship to academia and always felt out of place, never really satisfied with the way in which thinking and philosophy was understood to work in the academy and the kind of systems and constraints that it was placed under. So I've kind of managed to eke out a living just about for over a decade now by, I suppose, just going after the things that otherwise wouldn't get published. That's now kind of a principle for me. Like I wouldn't publish something that someone else would publish most of the time. And apart from that, I do a bit of writing myself, and I try to do some philosophizing, but increasingly difficult to do so because the work of just kind of keeping Urbanomic running is quite a burden. But a burden I'm happy to have, but it's kind of takes up almost all my time and then some. And I'm also doing translation work just from French. So I've translated a few books by Laruelle, Badiou, and a few others. Yeah.
Excellent. I want to make sure that everybody on this call gets plenty of time to ask you questions. I mean, you, Matt, and you, Corey, obviously, and you, Robin. Like, any questions you have about you have for or about us?
Which one of you is Joe Rogan?
Oh yeah,
am I in the right place
tonight?
One thing you said there, actually, that I would like to unpick a little bit, is you mentioned your uneasy relationship with the Academy. And all of us, I think, actually are, in some sense, para-academics, maybe, just by virtue of pursuing some kind of like philosophical interests in some variety or the other without being in an institution, anything like that. I got my master's degree from Sussex 4 years ago now, and have occasionally gotten very, very close to squandering any chance of financial stability I might have in the future by doing a PhD, but sanity always manages to steal my hand, which is why I'm a podcaster now. And yeah, so I mean, this project here was all the podcasts I've been involved with have been in some attempt or another trying to force myself and people I'm friends with to keep on reading philosophy books whilst trying to hold down real world jobs with varying levels of success. But anyway, you mentioned your own dissatisfaction with the Academy, and especially the systems and the limitations that involves. So just wondering if you could go into a little bit of detail about that more specifically.
Yeah, I think I try to address that through two concepts that are really important to me and that are very important to Mark Fisher and that arose over and over again on K-punk. And that's the two concepts of punk and pop. So basically, I think I'm a punk in the sense that, in the original sense of the punk, it's just being someone who doesn't really fit in any of the social groups that are available, and who doesn't really have anything at their disposal apart from themselves. So it's kind of like I don't have any background in anything. I feel like I grew up in a town that was just like a really anonymous town with nothing going on and nothing interesting about it. I don't have a strong family background of any kind of specific culture or religion or anything. And so, yeah, I'm kind of just a punk. And I arrived at university and I just punked around. Like, I didn't really go to lectures very much or I didn't really participate that much, to be honest. And I always felt like I'm not really inside the Academy, except during the years, obviously, like when we were doing CCRU and when I was involved in that kind of very tight community around Nick Land and Sadie and Mark Fisher. That's a completely different thing, though. That, in a sense, didn't belong to the university. So I always felt like I was there, but I never really... I suppose it's also something to do with class, that I never really felt like I was entitled to be there. Like, I don't really feel like I'm entitled to be anywhere, to be honest. But so I didn't have that sense of like, this is my right to be in this wonderful world of knowledge and I'm going to make the most of it. I just like hung around. So in that sense, I never really had a strong relationship to it. But of course, it was like an amazing experience to be at university, just because it means getting away from home and finding out about stuff, which I did as much through just kind of hanging around talking to people as I did through going to the library or going to lectures. So yeah, there's that kind of punk side to it, in that kind of very fundamental sense of punk. And then the pop side to it is like, I got so passionate about philosophy. Like, I was one of the people who was lucky enough to do a philosophy A-level, actually, which I ended up doing quite by accident when I was 17 and 18. And I immediately understood that as like something that I totally connected with. And I have two really amazing teachers there, actually, as an A-level student. One of the things I remember the most was that we used to have to like read out Socratic dialogues in class. Like, so someone had to be Socrates and someone had to be Cratylus or whoever. And that was really good fun. And so, yeah, I got very passionate about it. I got very into it. But I gradually came to understand, this is the process of learning philosophy, is like, you have all these amazing thoughts and then you realize that someone else has had them 270 years ago or even 1,000 years ago. So it's a humbling experience in that sense. And I came to realize that most of what people do in universities is, in a sense, just like coping with that and documenting, locating themselves within that history and documenting like some small part of it that they've chosen to specialize in. And that wasn't really what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was, if anything, promote that passion for philosophy, like that thing that really grabs hold of you when there's an idea that you connect directly to the problems of your life, and it kind of sweeps you away. So I had I'm more interested in how do you make a pop philosophy? And of course, I encountered Deleuze and Guattari and their concept of a pop philosophy, which is fair enough. Like, it's really cool. But Deleuze and Guattari were both, haute bourgeoisie Parisians who had gone totally through the system and knew what they were talking about. Well, Deleuze wasn't. I mean, Guattari is more of a renegade, I suppose, but they were very, very well educated, So then, I ended up being semi-educated in quite a sophisticated brand of philosophy, which in turn had internalized all the history of the philosophy that went before it. If you read Deleuze and Guattari, like, there's so much stuff in there. It's like the entire history of philosophy and psychoanalysis and history and anthropology is all compressed into this thing. So I kind of understood what rigorous philosophy was. But then I also was like, well, how do you connect to that without spending the rest of your life locked in a room reading other people's footnotes? And that is the problem. That's like the tension and the problem that's still driving me today.
I was maybe this is a way that can lead us into some of the more specific projects almost, but it's kind of linked to both of, I guess, Sean's question and your way of introducing yourself. That I think that it's a very humble way of introducing yourself, I think, because I think that in a lot of ways, I remember that you sort of said that you don't have so much time to philosophize, but actually I think your role as an editor, maybe one of the most important editors that is kind of around in contemporary philosophy, and in a kind of quite pop literary sense almost. I kind of think back to like the sort of 60s, 70s, you'd have these kind of rock star editor sort of people that would like do the beats and they'd bring these people in. And I almost feel like you're one of those people, which is, I can't think of anybody else who sort of fills that role. But how does that relate, do you think, to this sense of like of a pop philosophy of kind of, because in a way I suppose you are still reading other people's footnotes, but it's actually the footnotes that wouldn't be seen out in the world otherwise that are really particularly interesting ones.
No, exactly. And a lot of the authors that Urbanomic has worked with are academics. They have academic salaries, they have academic jobs, But as I said, it's not so much saying like, I'm not saying that I've succeeded in producing pop philosophy. I'm saying, in a sense, like that tension of trying to be rigorous and trying to communicate with what's really going on in philosophy in all of its rigor, but at the same time produce something that's communicable, that someone outside of that sphere can pick up. That tension and that problem is really the thing. That's what I would call pop philosophy. Pop philosophy is not something that you succeed in or that exists. It's a problem that you pursue. So the role of editor is, again, just like something that I fell into, because when I was doing my second PhD that I didn't finish, so after I was at Warwick, I kind of decided to just leave philosophy behind and go and get a proper job. And I had a job, and I just like did the real world for about 7 or 8 years. And then I realized the real world's shit and I want to do philosophy again. And then I started a PhD, and as soon as I got into a university setting, I was like, no, this is not it. This is not what I wanted to do. And that's when I started doing Collapse. So I kind of put together this journal, which was kind of my idea of what philosophy should be, which involved taking things from all different places and kind of munging them together into this weird format where they communicated in a kind of, so the different elements communicated even though they were from completely different places, and kind of produced this weird map of concepts. And yeah, so I kind of accidentally did it just out of, in a sense, like out of a negative feeling of, I know that academic philosophy isn't what I want to do, and then trying to produce something positive out of that. But as I said, it's only in recent years that I've started admitting this to other people, but first to myself. A lot of the models I realize now for Collapse were like totally low culture. One of them being like Beano annuals. You know, like these annuals you used to get I guess they went up through the 80s probably, and they don't exist anymore. They had like a selection of comics, stories, puzzles and stuff. And I always remember as a child the feeling of having one of these books that seemed like it had so much stuff in it and all these heterogeneous elements. And then what was the other one? Oh yeah, Reader's Digest. So it's all like these, somehow unconsciously, I had this idea of the kind of book that I wanted to make. It produced this freakish thing. So over the years then, like retrospectively, I started looking at what I've done and being like, oh, that's what I do. And then that kind of becomes self-reinforcing. I kind of understand there's a certain type of, montage really, like putting things together, that is what I do, or what I've ended up doing.
I remember quite a long time ago now, must have been, when this would have been, more than 10 years ago now, I remember Alan Moore attempting to do something similar with a magazine series that him and some of his
Dodgem Logic.
Oh, yeah,
yes, correct,
that, exactly. And the reason why that came to mind was I remember its motto was colliding ideas to see what happens.
Yeah.
In fact, I still have, because I've got behind me, I've got two, it's a pure tangent now. I've got two plastic boxes filled with my old 2000 AD comics. And one of those folders does contain the entirety of Dodgem Logic, which I think is actually worth a few pennies now. Maybe I'll part with that.
I've got the full set as well.
I had the first one, but how many issues did it run for?
Not that many, because
eight,
something like that. Because I remember the editorial of the very last issue, Alan Moore saying it transpires that our business model of having no advertising and paying our contributors a decent wage was a terrible idea. We've never broken even.
That's not the way to get on in publishing. No, it's never going to work.
No, there's nothing wrong with being a bit mercenary. So we've already mentioned in passing Warwick, CCRU, and allied entities. And I would very, 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 very much like to hear from the horse's mouth what CCRU was all about, what it was to be in the inside, how you came to it in particular. And just what, for as much as you can, because I know it was a period of, famous intensity. Just however you can articulate what it was like to be a part of that would be absolutely fascinating.
Well, so my time at Warwick kind of half overlaps with the CCRU in the sense that I was there at the beginning of the CCRU, but as I mentioned, I kind of just got sick of being at university and I wanted to leave. And so like that latter part, which is all the weird stuff that you see in the CCRU writings, I wasn't actually there. But I seem to be the only person who will talk about it publicly. So I've now accepted that role. And I can
maybe that's precisely why.
I was there in a sense in like during years when a lot of these ideas were kind of fermenting, if you like, and forming. So I kind of understand where they came from. But to continue the story I was telling before, when I arrived at Warwick, I guess I hadn't chosen Warwick at all. I don't really think like when I was a teenager, I had any sense of like choosing anything in my life. I just like wandered from one thing to another. And that happened to be one of the universities that I happened to pick off a list. I didn't really know anything about it. I knew it had a philosophy department and I decided I wanted to carry on doing philosophy. And so when I got there, in the first year, the only thing I really enjoyed doing was symbolic logic because it was like computer programming, and I'd like been programming computers since I was like 7 or 8 years old. Had a ZX81, so I was really into computer programming. And in fact, I only started doing A-level philosophy because I had a timetable clash and I couldn't do computer science. So things could have turned out very differently, and I could have been a lot richer today if that hadn't happened. But when I got there, like the first year courses, there was like something on Descartes, there was like an introduction to metaphysics, and it was all quite disappointing. And I guess it was like only part of the way through that year, or maybe in the second year, when I was feeling really quite lost and didn't fit in and pretty depressed, really. And I think I must have chosen one of the courses on Nietzsche or something, which brought me into contact with Nick Land. And he was like a very generous and he was always open to like conversations with anybody. And like there was no kind of discrimination between whether you were a staff member or an undergraduate or a postgraduate. And so there was a kind of a group around him, a kind of shifting group of people who would meet in the bar and talk with him. And in talking with Nick, I kind of finally connected to someone who had something like the concept about what philosophy was for that I did, which is that we're in like a massive abyssal black space of complete desolation, and we're like poking around trying to find some kind of features of this in this darkness. And it's kind of torturous, but also it's incredibly exciting. And so in those kind of, in a sense, childish or juvenile ideas about what philosophy should be, I finally, after a year of misery, found someone who was like, no, that is what philosophy is. And increasingly, this kind of group of people around him, which was like this kind of informal, it would be like totally grand to say it was like an informal seminar. It wasn't. It was just like people drinking in the bar. But there was a sense of there being a group. And that was in itself interesting. There was a group that was at the university, but that wasn't academic, that wasn't, an organized entity.
A body without organs, one might say.
Yes, indeed. I guess at that time already there was this sense in which there was a kind of synthetic program of philosophy going on. Like there were people from different departments who were in that group, like people who were doing physics, people who were from the business school, people from law, people studying literature. And there was this kind of cross-pollination of ideas, I suppose, vaguely centered around the ideas of complexity theory and emergence and autopoiesis, but also increasingly engaged with the new realm of the digital, the internet, etc. So yeah, that kind of, I suppose that was a very formative thing for me to suddenly see that you could link together these ideas from all these different spheres, and that in a sense, like, Nick was, if not at the center of it, he was the person who would kind of make these unexpected connections and feed them back into the group a lot of the time. And, let's face it, also, things do change, but he was a very charismatic and inspiring person. And, he gathered people around him, and that it was really exciting. And a very positive person. Like, in spite of, you can read his early work, like Thirst for Annihilation, and think this is like some grim, dark person who's obsessed with the darkest aspects of the universe. But he's like an incredibly positive, kind person who would, like I say, like talk to anyone and engage with anyone on any level. So kind of superconductor, really, between different pools of ideas. At some point along the way, there was also music involved, and there was like the kind of university clubs and stuff that we used to go to. So that was all pre-CCRU. And at that time, really from all the same motives that I was mentioning before, I started making what I now know was a fanzine. At the time, I didn't know any. Again, like I was such a punk, I didn't even know about punk things like fanzines. So I was just like, I'm just going to make this magazine on the photocopier with loads of weird pseudo philosophy stuff about technology and whatever, and just did it. And then like invented a launch party in the philosophy common room, and then like, I don't know, photocopied 100 copies of it or something. And I guess I probably at that time sent a message out on one of these early cyberculture mailing lists, so made some kind of connections there. So that was the first version of Collapse, was this fanzine, which ran for like just 2 issues because I was too lazy to print the third one. And then, so I think Nick had kind of began to be an attractor for the philosophy department, and a lot of PhD students kind of came and wanted to work with him, and so that group around him grew. And at a certain point then, the CCRU began, really kind of was invented as a vehicle, I think, for Sadie Plant to come and kind of set up a research centre in Warwick, which would, in a sense, like, it was designed to formalise this vague area of study that had been emerging, i.e. like complex systems, understanding culture as a cybernetic system, understanding the effects of digitization and automation on human culture, understanding the effects on what how the human can be understood. This kind of whole broad spectrum of questions. So CCIU was kind of an official thing at first for a while. And Sadie, who had been at the Department for Cultural Studies at Birmingham, moved to Warwick. And she brought with her, I think, 5 or 6 of her then PhD students from Birmingham, one of whom was Mark. And that was a really interesting situation, okay, because you've got someone who isn't trained in philosophy, and she's bringing these students who aren't trained in philosophy, but who have a background in kind of thinking about culture and have a disenchanted with the current model of cultural studies. So they're trying to find new ways to think about culture. Sadie was trained in philosophy, but I've lost my train of thought there. Yeah. So yeah, but Sadie was trained in philosophy. But what I was going to say was there was this kind of interesting tension then that was produced, because the philosophy department, I mean, I don't know what the actual story is, but the philosophy department certain elements in the department were not happy about this kind of intrusion of something which wasn't proper philosophy. At the same time, it seems to me like there was some kind of marketing angle on this, because Sadie kind of got into a few Sunday magazines and stuff. I think they were like promoting it as some kind of like innovative new thing for the university.
She was the it girl of the 21st century, right? That's what the Independent called her at one point.
Yeah. Or her and Nick were described as being the Sartre and de Beauvoir of the of the late 20th century. To which I think that was in the Sunday Times, and then someone wrote in a letter which was printed the next week, which said more like Beavis and Butthead, which Nick was really delighted with. He thought that was a far better thing to be compared to, I think.
I just find it strange that academic figures even ended up in like the Sunday Times. Like, I couldn't imagine that happening today.
Well, I mean, they do, but for the worst possible reasons, don't they? Like Kathleen Stock. But yeah. So the idea that somehow there could be like excitement around a philosophy lecturer, that does seem strange. But I think it was a failed attempt. There was someone somewhere, I think, who was like trying to produce this figure, and it didn't quite work. I kind of met Mark and the other people who he hung around with earlier, because they had this thing. This was what really appealed to me. They had basically what was a theory gang. That was the first time I ever came across a theory gang, which was called Switch. And they used to turn up at conferences, and there's like 4 or 5 of them, and they'd like stand in a line passing the mic to each other, like intoning this cryptic kind of intoxicating theory fictional stream of consciousness type of thing.
It does,
and everyone would just be like totally silent and not know what to make of it, and then someone would like get up and start talking about footnotes.
Just to say, does sound ever so slightly like you're about to say that they would go to these conferences and would fundamentally start rapping about philosophy.
Called slam poetry.
Yeah,
probably not too far off, I imagine.
So they already had like this kind of idea of, I suppose, theory as performance, or as a cultural object in its own right, not like theorizing about culture in a kind of patronizing way, which I think is how they saw ultimately the status quo in cultural studies, was that it was always talking about culture and talking down to culture, even when it was studying subcultures.
There was I don't know if this is maybe a bit of a nerdy point, but it just kind of came to mind because I think that I'm curious if this was an adaptation, because I know that Mark's PhD was in philosophy and literature, and that's still a course that they run. Was that a development from that time then, do you think, of bridging those two things consciously around that time? Or
Warwick Philosophy Department had quite a pioneering program in philosophy and literature. So you had a lot of people there who were studying things like Blanchot, so that existed, I think, for some time before. And of course, like, you got to remember, Warwick was one of the maybe like 3 or 4 universities in the UK that did continental philosophy at all. So that in itself was kind of freakish. In fact, the department was kind of split. There was like quite a lot of analytic philosophers as well. And they kind of cohabited more or less harmoniously. But yeah, the philosophy and literature program had been there for a while. I didn't know that about Mark's PhD though. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's philosophy, and he's basically writing about, I guess, a lot of William Gibson. So flatline constructs makes a bit more sense in that, I guess. But
when Sadie set up this unit in Warwick, there was a cybernetic culture program, and some of the people who were there, I'm sure Steve Goodman has a PhD in cybernetic culture. There's like 5 or 6 people in the world who have a PhD in cybernetic culture from that short period. Because
Steve Goodman of Hyperdub Records.
Yeah,
so just so people know who he is. Sorry.
Yeah. So, because the next part of that story is that I think essentially the environment became so hostile, and Sadie just felt like, why am I doing this? These people don't want me here. That really the official existence of that entity, the cybernetic culture entity, really lasted, I think, between 6 and 9 months or something. It wasn't really there for a long time. And Sadie left. And so the people who she had transferred to Warwick, I suppose, then consolidated into a kind of a support group to be able to survive in this environment. To more or less of an extent, kind of then melded with this group that was already there, kind of around Nick Land. And so that then, like, I think they had demanded or asked nicely, and they were given a bare office at the end of a corridor, which then they wrote CCRU on the door. And, we used to kind of go and hang out there. And that's all the CCRU was then, really. It was just like a name on a door that didn't really exist, but that was a way to bind together these people who had kind of arrived at Warwick in the expectation that there was this kind of new synthetic discipline that was being sketched out and developed there. I think that I listened earlier, quite recently, to an early talk that Sadie gave at the time when she was setting up the program, and that's the tone that I hear in that, is that there was a kind of optimism that from all sorts of angles, from all sorts of disciplines, the disciplinary model was no longer good enough, and what was needed was some kind of overarching way of looking at complex systems, at their interactions, at the way that cultural forces work. And so CCRU kind of became that, but outside of any academic context. I mean, inside the academy spatially, but really outside conceptually.
I guess I know that I'm maybe going to set Sean up here because I know Sean was particularly interested. I guess part of what we were talking about in I think our first session was, I guess between the three of us, we probably maybe this isn't a fair way to divvy ourselves up, but I guess there's plenty of overlap. That's why we get on so well. But I guess that there's Sean, you're particularly interested in sort of the occulted stuff. Corey, you're sort of more on the sort of fiction side of things, and I guess that I'll take philosophy at a punt, but I guess we all sort of share those interests. But I guess that one thing I was thinking of was that you were talking about this. You mentioned this sense of autopoiesis as kind of a part of.
Can you define that, please, Matt?
Yeah, that's it. I was actually asking if Robin, if you could define that, and maybe how that relates to that relationship between sort of theory fiction and I guess more of the occulted stuff that gets drawn into the CCRU as well.
Sorry, what are you asking me to define?
Autopoiesis.
Autopoiesis, right. Yeah. That's a concept that came from these two guys working in biology, Varela and Maturana, who are working kind of on the border of biology and complex systems, and just trying to understand, what's the difference between a purely physical system governed by chains of cause and effect and a biological system which seems to have some kind of higher level unity. So autopoiesis is a way of understanding how complex machines maintain themselves and reproduce, I guess, or reproduce themselves at least. So it's part of a kind of family of different concepts that I think was emerging over the late 20th century, which tried to understand, which tried to find rigorous ways to think beyond a purely physicalist, determinist model, and tried to say, what's happening in these extremely complex systems can't be understood purely from the point of view of a load of little billiard balls like bashing into one another on a grand scale. We have to come up with some kind of conceptualization of the way in which these systems fit together at different scales and the way in which they reproduce their identity. And that also connects with the concept of feedback, which was a hugely important concept for before and during the CCRU era. The concept of negative feedback being the idea that a system adjusts itself to the any excitations that are coming from outside it so as to preserve its identity. So negative feedback was the thing that the theory of autopoiesis and most of cybernetics was concerned with, is like, how do things maintain themselves in a hostile environment? How do they stay the same? But then I guess the real thrust of the innovation of how Nick was thinking these things and how Sadie was thinking them was to foreground positive feedback instead, was to foreground these instances in which, rather than adjusting itself to stay the same, the system would kind of escalate, take in energy and escalate and transform and change into something else. The prime example, of course, being capitalism, which rather than maintaining itself in a stable state seems to consume exponential amounts of energy and produce exponential amounts of transformation to the point where it becomes highly unpredictable and uncontrollable.
That's not what I thought autopoiesis meant at all. So.
Well, maybe I'm totally wrong.
No. I mean,
autopoiesis is basically like, just means making yourself, right?
Self-becoming.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. I guess I didn't actually know the answer, but I think in my head I'd associate it with I think, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the nomenclature, but I really like Schelling's got these lectures on mythology, and he talks about poesy in there. And I always thought it was kind of related, but actually, from what you said, I guess they kind of are relatable. So, it's. I wondered what the relationship between octopuses was to culture, but I guess that's. I mean, I'm imagining if there's that feedback loop, it's maybe between what you were talking about at the start, right? That maybe if we've got these layers, this pop layer and this punk layer, or this sort of pop layer and this sort of occult layer, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, in a sense, like poesis is a really interesting word because, yes, when we hear poesis, we think of like poetry, and therefore we think of the cultural production and the things that humans make. But poesis really is just like any kind of production. So that, in a sense, is kind of what the CCRU was trying to do, like to say culture is a type of production, and cybernetics is the best way to understand production. Therefore, we need a cybernetic theory of culture.
Yeah.
But as I was just saying, that's the significance that Heidegger finds in the term poesis and its relationship with poetry and his phenomenological explorations of becoming. But that's neither here nor there. That's for a different podcast. It doesn't actually exist. I would like to talk a little, or rather, I'd like to maybe prompt Corey to maybe ask some questions about science fiction as a way of continuing this discussion a little bit as to how the CCRU functioned and what its influences were.
Yeah, I mean, because for me personally, the sections on Burroughs talk to me the most because I'm a big fan of him and discovered the CCRU collection after having read, most of Burroughs' published works. So I guess, and that also ties into the occult angle because we know that Burroughs was an adept curse wielder, if nothing else. So yeah, like how did you find, or like how did the literary elements kind of feed into the CCRU's greater program? Was it simply that they were like informal, or more was it is it simply that people enjoyed Burroughs and found a way to work him in, or was there considered to be like a deeper meaning there?
There was. So to go back to like the general setting at Warwick, I think there was already possibly like a small community of people around the philosophy and literature program who were already kind of trying to think authors, science fiction authors, like philosophically. And certainly, I think by the time I arrived there, or by the time I became aware of Nick's work, the way that I would have become aware of Nick's work was that you'd meet someone in the bar and they'd be like, did you know there's a lecturer who in the philosophy department who thinks that he's a cyborg who's come from the future? So, Nick was already kind of using these science fiction tropes in his work. On the level of content, in the sense that it was an attempt to like shake philosophy out of its complacency and say, like, look, point philosophy towards the future and towards thinking, we can no longer keep working with these ancient traditional models of the human and of being and so on. We have to understand that all of these things are being dismantled bit by bit by capitalism. So it was, in a sense, like the content of the thinking itself is science fictional, but there's also a formal stylistic element that the text itself is a cybernetic machine. The text itself is like this thing that's exciting the reader and bringing them into this kind of virtual space and using the reader as a channel for positive feedback. And I always say, like, with cybernetic culture, you've got to understand it in those two ways. You've got to understand it as being understanding how cybernetic machines, how the age of technology infiltrates culture, but also understanding how culture itself is a cybernetic machine. And so I think, Nick was really on that path already, was with kind of absorbing the early cyberpunk writings like William Gibson and Neil Stephenson. And at the time, I suppose in the 90s, like that amazing kind of period of these movies like Terminator and Predator, which became kind of like core texts in a way. Especially obviously like the time element in Terminator. And I think if we're going to talk about CCIU, we're going to have to like talk about time sooner or later. Because of course Burroughs also comes up in the text Lemurian Time War, which I just think is like one of the most intense, inexhaustibly fascinating philosophical texts ever. It's just amazing. And yeah, so these figures like Burroughs, Philip K. Dick as well. I mean, these are people in whom science fiction and philosophical speculation are already like totally entangled and inextricable, I think, aren't they?
Yeah.
And so in a way, you could say CCIU is one of the few enterprises to really extend that tradition rather than studying it from outside. They're really like synthesizing these elements from these different places and producing more of this type of writing, which is at once has like the compelling character of fiction and the theoretical kind of incisive theoretical equipment that's drawn from philosophy.
I also seem to find some like video game culture leaking in. Like I can't remember the name of the piece, but there's one in the back half of the collection that's basically, it kind of seems like the description of a video game that would be quite like Resident Evil, but in a CCRU setting. And it's just, so I also saw like, video game influence coming in, which would have been like, I guess, kind of more of a cultural cutting edge than it is now, where it's, ubiquitous.
That comes from, so that's really the next period of the story, is that at a certain point, I guess when most of the people who were doing Cybernet, that were part of the Cybernetic culture program, were finishing up their PhDs. Nick also left. Basically, they just kind of jumped ship, left Warwick, and were kind of living in Leamington Spa, famously above the Body Shop. And I think that's the time from which most of these writings date. So in a sense, like that's when it became really an intense kind of production regime. I think it became more intense, and they were kind of coagulating this whole mythos and this whole set of ideas into a very consistent framework, and producing all of this stuff without having like any outlet for it necessarily, or any official status or reason to do it.
Sometimes that's when the best work comes out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just like following this line feverishly, I think is the right word.
Just
sorry. What I was going to say was, so I think that part of that was this kind of what obviously would seem from our perspective a deludedly megalomaniac idea that CCRU is going to become like this massive corporate entity producing video games that are going to infiltrate people's minds. And so that was kind of one of the spin-off projects that was mooted at that time, I think.
So of interest, were you all I assume at least some of you were reading Grant Morrison's The Invisibles during all of this, right?
I felt like it was the other way around when I read CCRU. I was pretty sure that Grant Morrison was plugged into the CCRU's output.
You see,
it was the other way around.
The thing is, like, it's interesting that you brought up Burroughs, and I'm saying, like, in a sense, CCRU were carrying on the tradition. Like, they really were taking in these ideas from Burroughs and slotting them into this new kind of expanded framework. But that's really there's very few kind of precursors otherwise, I think. And when I talk to people about CCRU, they're often like, oh, they must have known about this, or they must have been reading this. And I think the amazing thing about CCRU is, like, some of it just genuinely just came from nowhere. Like, there's something truly disturbing about it, in the sense, like, you can't really understand. Yes, part of it is synthesizing a whole load of different sources, but there's a dimension to it that is, to this day, very strange and inexplicable as to how this kind of disturbing consistency can arise from such a messy situation.
I might use this, and I do want us to talk about time travel. Don't worry, but I will use this as and I'm aware that this might be more to do with the latter period of CCRU, which you weren't involved with. But I want to talk at least a little bit about the influence of occultism on the project, then, especially as that's a very good lead-in you gave there. You gave there the implication of CCRU being infiltrated by extra-human intelligences. But especially Kenneth Grant's work seems to loom through a lot of, maybe not a lot, but there certainly seems to be influences coming in from that direction. And I was just wondering if there is something that you can tell us a little bit more about, even if it is just talking a little bit more about the general kind of like spooky atmosphere of the place. And I think it isn't Leamington, and if I recall correctly, Leamington Spa is, of course, the birthplace of Alistair Crowley as well.
Yeah, so
may or may not be above the body shop, but
a few of the CCRU, Nick, Anna, and Mark, I think, lived in a house in Leamington Spa that they only later found out was the place where he was born, where Crowley was born. So some of these writings were actually written in that house. Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert on occultism. I suppose all that I can talk about is what I understand to be the driving idea behind the numogram, which is as a kind of subversion of the tree of life and therefore of a large part of the occult tradition, but also like its connection to numerology and to the Kabbalah and so on. And I think the numogram was kind of, if we can say it's devised, everyone involved always says it's invented, but if we can say it's devised so as to be an occult instrument that doesn't require any belief. Like, you don't have to believe in anything in order to work the numogram. And that's because it's, rather than being based on some kind of esoteric use of numbers or numerology in the traditional sense, in which numbers are associated with, each number is associated with a kind of mythical figure or something. The numogram at its core is just simply like a thing that works and is based on the numbers that we know and on very basic arithmetic. So it kind of forms this incredibly solid, unquestionable basis for doing this working. And then around that, there's the whole system of demons, which is kind of, I think of it as something like the I Ching, like it's a way in which you can understand the world. If you become well versed in moving around the numogram and understanding the zones and understanding the passages between them, then it's a way in which you can look at the world. Just the same as once you use the I Ching enough, you begin to enter into its consistency and begin to see the world in the way that the I Ching sees the world. And that's kind of the type of instrument it is. And then on a third layer outside that, then you've got this whole series of stories which are kind of about how the numogram was discovered. This kind of history of all these fictional figures like Echidna Stillwell, who are associated with it, which serves as a kind of a fictional universe that draws you in to the system. So it's really interesting. It's a kind of a whole apparatus. It's not just an occult working. It also has this whole apparatus designed to bring you into the world through the fiction. So it's a really interesting kind of, I think, very novel amalgam of syncretic occultism, fiction, and philosophical thinking about time.
We've been speaking for, we don't have a time limit or anything like that. I'm just conscious rather of just that we know we do have all have things to do at some point. So I think there's a couple of last topics I think that we should aim to cover. Firstly, just carrying on from that, I think it would be good if we did speak specifically about time and time travel, especially because I know there's something, and we should also talk a little bit about Children of the Stones, because I know that you wanted to talk to us a little bit about that. So let's cover that off and then move on to concluding by talking about By the North Sea. Time travel. Actually, I'm just going to ask it. I actually promised myself I wasn't going to try and delve into the lurid details with CCRU, because I don't think.
But how do you time travel?
Well, how do you time travel?
We want to know.
But what I was going to ask is, when Nick Land said that he is a cybernetic organism come back from the future. Yeah, did he mean that? When he was saying saying these things, or is saying these things, what's the tone? What's the vibe? Is this dead-eyed seriousness, or is this a jovial clownishness, or something somewhere in between?
Oh, that's such a difficult. Is it like that? In a sense, it's the wrong question, because it's a temptation to try and think in terms of belief. Like, are we meant to believe that he really believes that or not? The question is one of producing machines, right? The text is a machine that produces a certain intensity in the reader, and produces, in a sense, like those texts themselves are like occult workings that become a way of seeing the world. Like, they change your way of seeing the world, and that's their function. Whether or not anyone believes in it is kind of beside the point, I think. But let me say this, that I think during my strong memory of being involved in this group of people at Warwick, and I think one of the reasons why everyone who was involved in that scene has been somewhat kind of dazed and confused for years afterwards, and decades even afterwards, is that there was definitely something very strange going on there, in terms of like this building together this collective way of thinking about reality that was very far removed from the consensual model. Yeah.
There's one way I think of maybe putting that question, and it's maybe going the other way. But I remember we thought about this a lot when I was a student at Goldsmiths, and I remember this kind of has overlap really, because I don't know if there will be some people who are aware of this who are listening, but I have a bot that I made called Geopoetics that was partly from a class that Robin, that you taught at Goldsmiths for a couple of years. But I guess this will revert back, I guess, because it's kind of, maybe there's something about that question of time travel in there that I think with that as a sort of tool in itself, as a kind of pop tool, I think a lot of people, when I made that bot, a lot of people were making bots. They were quite common things for a while, and you kind of look at the inner working of a sort of a thing like that, and I guess it was sort of delved into the workings of it a bit, and it's a thing called a Markov chain. So you literally have a set, I guess it's like the I Ching. You have a set text, you sort of you have a sort of system that you put numbers into, and it will generate numbers back out and use that to read the sort of core text that you have. So this bot spews out weird sentences from my notes from that seminar. And I guess actually another way of putting that now that's maybe more current, this was 5 years ago, but I think it's very much how we think about like Google Deep Dream. Right, you have but maybe that way that you have the other way around. You don't really see the numbers that they're going into that sort of system, but you input an image or a concept, and it will into this kind of closed system, and it will spew out these kind of alternate ways of seeing the world, or these kind of twisted visions on life. And I always often think of the numogram like that. It's kind of like in this kind of accelerated cultural time that we've been living for the past couple of decades. It's almost like a relatively rudimentary form of that, as if that's kind of the base system, and what you put into it and what you put out of it, as if you could reduce that down to a symbol. That symbol of that kind of system, be it a Twitter bot or AI Deep Dream, is kind of like the numogram. It's that kind of tool. But if you reduce it back far enough, you do get something that feels wholly occulted. And I think that's always the tension that I loved about it, that as much as it feels utterly occulted in the CCRU context, we're actually that kind of system we use all the time. We just don't really think about it or know about it.
Yeah, right. It's a model for engaging with reality, yeah. I mean, from the point of view of, like, if you want to say, did CCRU know something about the future that at the time no one else did? I think there are plenty of things that you could point to. Like, there weren't many people talking about the things that CCRU were talking about at that time, certainly in Western academia. But also, you know, what's really fascinating now is that, you know, if you want to do a podcast about the numogram, you should be inviting like people who are like in their teens, who are like total experts on it, who I meet online now, which is amazing, because you've got to remember,
the TikTok witches.
Don't underestimate the sheer, like, absolute utter disappearance of CCRU. Like, after 2001, it just didn't exist. No one knew about it. No one cared about it. No one was interested in it for decades. And so there's something really fascinating that it's almost like the hysterical, crazy complexity of the online world that has emerged only in the last, like, 7-8 years, now finally is a suitable place for people to be engaging with this stuff. You know, whether you could take that various ways, you know, people are now insane enough to be taking this seriously, or it was serious to begin with. But that, I mean, that in itself is really fascinating. But from the point of view of time, you know, a simple way to put it would just be, it's the intuition that sense travels backwards. We can no longer make sense of the present in the terms that we have inherited from the past. Things are happening before they make sense. And therefore, you know, the only way to truly engage with the present reality is to project it forward and to think back from the future. But technically, if you want to, like, talk about it philosophically, I think it's like a mixture of Kant and Freud, because you know, with Kant you have the introduction of transcendental philosophy, which basically means the only things that we have access to are appearances, okay? And appearances are conditioned by space and time. And then you have the idea of the noumenon, right? Is there something outside that's the actual thing apart from the appearance? Is there something beyond the appearance? There's no way for us to know because we're always trapped inside time and space. And this is where it connects to the whole Burroughs thing about being trapped in the reality studio, and this whole kind of many different kind of discourses of suspicion about, you know, the system of reality and who's controlling it, which comes out in the Who's Pulling Your Strings and texts like that. So there's this idea from Kant that, you know, our experience is assembled through these conditions of space and time, but it's assembled from something else, some ulterior thing, which is outside of time. And then from psychoanalysis, I think, and maybe this was not specifically a source, but ambiently, you get this conception of the idea that you can rewrite your experience. So the crucial thing that happens in psychoanalysis or any kind of therapy, right, is that you end up saying something and you didn't know you were going to say it, and you didn't know it was true, and yet it's you who's speaking it, and you're talking about yourself, and what you say transforms what you knew about yourself, and it transforms your past into something else. So in effect, like psychoanalysis, the analysand in psychoanalysis is engaged in a form of time travel, in a form of the manipulation of time, which, according to the chronological normal conception of time, should be impossible. Like you can't go back and rewrite the entire past. And then the CCRU kind of bring these stories, these philosophical stories about time together in a way that I think is heavily influenced by like Marvel Comics, like science fiction, in which there are these two warring forces. There's the Architectonic Order of the Eschaton, the AOE, who their whole mission is to secure time and to make sure that no one ever doubts that things move in a certain sequence and you can't get outside of that sequence. You're trapped inside of the timeline and everything's already completely determined forever, like from the beginning to the end. But the whole point is, in order for the AOE to have to exist, in order for this time police to be there, then it must be the case that, in fact, there are some leakages, like there are some kind of escape routes, there is some kind of egress, or else there is something that there's some instances in which something gets in from outside time, from outside chronological time. And of course, like in psychoanalysis, that would be things like deja vu or the symptom in general. The symptom in general is something that's outside of the present time. It's something that's acting from another order of time in the present. And so you have this suspicion that perhaps there are instances in which we can get outside the timeline, break outside the timeline. And that then becomes the other side of this kind of Manichaean battle, which is the Lemurians. The Lemurians are the ones who can travel outside of the timeline and connect things in this disordered, anomalous way. And so to go back to this question about, did Nick really believe he could travel backwards in time and so on? Let me refer back to what I said about the numogram. I think what the CCRU did, and this was something that happened before the numogram existed as well, what this group of people were doing was building a way of understanding reality that they could share, and that in creating a vocabulary to talk about reality differently, you create this microculture within which you all are kind of reinforcing each other in talking in a certain way about reality, and therefore actually altering your perception of reality. And that I absolutely understand that sounds like a cult, and it shares a lot of features with what cults do. But I think the difference, I guess, would be this was kind of a collective, creative endeavor. But that's what it ended up doing, I think, is produce a vocabulary that's consistent, a consistent way to talk about reality that's far from the normal story, the AOE story.
I think that's kind of like almost the most important legacy, almost, or at least that's the thing that seems to carry forwards, that even without that specific kind of mythological structure, I guess what a lot of people that were involved in the CCIU, like yourself and Mark and others, always carried forwards was that kind of linguistic playfulness of always not necessarily relying on the nomenclature of kind of canonical philosophy, but actually that's what Kojo would always say, right? You're concept engineers, and that though that's kind of it's something that I always think about all the time. That especially remember something that came up recently was someone was talking about capitalist realism as like a really such an engaging and accessible book, and yet talked about one phrase in it that was that's alienating to the everyman or something. But I guess the point is always that that's sort of the point. You want to you have to introduce new concepts, because that's how you come to like find that journey outside of that kind of temporal I don't know, like bowling lane.
This is a point at which we should talk about Mark's specific contribution, really.
Sure.
Which is that, which goes back to this question of pop, of like, Mark was really, I remember like when Mark first arrived at Warwick, and we would have conversations like he'd tell me about stuff like Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy, stuff from cultural studies, and I'd tell him about Kant, and like we'd have these weird conversations of meeting in the middle, and Mark was a hell of an amazingly receptive thinker who could like grasp the essentials of something and then redeploy it. And I think the way that he redeployed things was by, as he always said, like thinking through pop culture. That's the only way I can think, he used to say. Like I have to think through music or through movies or through comics. And I think that to me is like the really crucial contribution of Mark in CCIU, or where I see his signature, is like, let's not just have the numogram, right? Let's not just have this device with numbers on it. Let's also not just have these demons with funny names that are attached to the passages between the numbers, but let's also then have this other layer of these kind of Marvel Comics like storylines with all these characters, which serve as a way to bring in a reader who's not really necessarily conscious of where they're going with it. They're just like, this is a cool story. And then they discovered this thing called the numogram. And then the thing in the story called the numogram turns out to be an actual thing. Or is it an actual thing? Like, is the diagram illustrating a story? Or is the story true? Or is the story something that was made up based on the fact that the diagram is a real thing? And I think that amazing kind of way of thinking rigorous philosophical concepts through pop culture can only come from someone who understands that, when you read a Marvel comic, you're reading philosophy. Like, those concepts already in there. That's what those things, they're all to do with like insane powers and forces beyond the human realm. Philosophy and concepts are already going on in those stories. So I think that's kind of where I recognize Mark's distinctive contribution. Let me apologise about the skateboard spanner noises that are going on in the background.
Oh, is that what's going on?
There's like a whole workshop going on.
Making a cup of tea or something.
I mean, it just adds to the punk. It adds to the punk energy, though, doesn't it? Oh, no, that's just literally a skateboard in the background.
You want to see my new skateboard?
Yes.
This is my new deck. I just got to set it up. Can you see it?
Oh, you have to put it in front of Robin. I think it's blurry.
It glows in the dark.
Oh, cool. There's eyeballs?
Hi. Yeah, it's full of eyeballs. It's by a British artist.
That's cool. Did
Anyway,
you get it local?
On.
Yeah, sorry.
So you see, like, the real expert on CCIU was in the background all the time while I was just talking rubbish.
It feels like a Zen parable almost, doesn't it? The real master sits behind quietly constructing the skateboard and has no need to speak.
Yeah. But I mean, when I was saying, that the CCIU just didn't exist for all that time.
Yes.
Amy's one of the people who kind of reassembled it, really. Like, she kind of put together a lot of this history, and in doing so, kind of connected back a lot of the people back together so we could reassemble the history of what the hell happened. It's kind of interesting that, I mean, it is kind of like going to therapy. Like, every time I talk with Steve, it's kind of like we're doing a post-traumatic CCIU therapy session to try and put together the story of what the hell happened and to try and rebuild a continuous timeline.
That's what I was thinking when you were talking about psychoanalysis. Like, I guess that's way of looking back at the past to read it differently in the present into the future, as a kind of like, it's kind of do the ultimate callback to, I guess, where we started, of a kind of like autopoiesis of the self sort of vibe. But I guess that's, and I mean, like, maybe that's a nice segue into what I know we wanted to kind of bring things forward to the present. You've kind of you've gone from making sort of fanzines with I guess it was Warwick's reprographics department on the old photocopier, to now having your full-blown publishing house. And I guess, you have been revisiting a lot of this stuff over the years, but I guess how has a lot of this sort of factored into what you do nowadays, and how much is that, I guess, well, I guess that's it really. Yeah. What's that influence that's kind of carrying forward specifically about what you're interested in right now?
Yeah, I mean, the whole trajectory of Urbanomic, inevitably, because most of the time it's just been me doing it, is also a kind of an autobiography of me groping towards trying to work out what it is that I want to do. So part of the reason why the publication catalogue of Urbanomic is so eclectic, and yet I hope consistent, is because it's like to do with me ricocheting between all of these different types of thinking and orienting myself within the field of what's possible in contemporary thinking in order to kind of blindly find some way forward. And since Mark's death in 2017, which then led to re-editing publishing the CCIU writings through Urbanomic, that's now become far more of a part of my thinking, and I suppose, like, consciously thinking, a part of what I'm trying to do is to, not necessarily in a nostalgic way, to try and recapture those lost intensities of what was going on there, because I think that's impossible, but at least to provide an environment or to be an enabler for that kind of microcultural production to happen, precisely just by, like, Urbanomic being a space where things get connected and linked together in strange circuits that otherwise wouldn't have done. So yeah, I think probably unconsciously it's been an influence for a long time. And increasingly it's more conscious because people are asking more about CCIU, and I'm thinking more about it. And I'm more accepting of the importance of that period of my life, I suppose, and trying to be faithful to it rather than kind of, I don't know, trying to either deny it or move on from it or, you know, just do something completely different. I'm trying to think of, ways in which to retain a kind of fidelity to that kind of crazy insistence that you can do this type of thing. Like, there's no place for it in the world. It might seem like there's no audience for it, but you can still do it. Like, you can connect together all this stuff and produce something that's neither philosophy nor theory nor fiction, and encourage other people to do that.
Yeah. I think it's kind of...
It just might take 15 years for people to start to get it.
Yeah.
I suppose that's the other... I mean, I guess it's I think that's partly what's so interesting about where things have gone in a way, because I guess we should acknowledge, as we already have done, you know, this is technically a Zer0 Books podcast, at least as at the moment. But I guess it's part of that same network. I suppose that Mark and Tarek were also at Warwick around that time, and I guess there's a similar sort of sentiment, right, that I guess people have taken in their own directions. But I guess it's how much of an impact that can have, I guess, between these different loosely connected. I mean, also, I guess if people haven't heard it, there's a great session of the Zer0 Books archives that was being run with Owen Hatherley, talking about the influence of semiotext on, I guess, Zer0. And I suppose that's probably the same for you, right, with Urbanomic. It's amazing how that's carried on.
They were some of the first books that I encountered where I was like, they were a real like cultural object, and they had a kind of attitude. The little foreign agent semiotic series, they're definitely a huge thing. But yeah, it's absolutely right. I think like if you look at the manifesto that Mark and Tarek wrote for Repeater and for Zer0, you can see exactly like it's that insistence that even if there isn't a space for this, we're going to make the space for this to be able to happen. And it's very much in the along the same lines as the CCIU, in the sense that it's not about academia, it's about culture. It's about the fact that you want the ideas to engage with the wider culture. And I think that's, in a sense, is like one of the testaments to the CCIU, is that, you know, a lot of the people who are involved in that at that time have gone on to do things that are important culturally, and not necessarily just like, gone on to write some good papers and go to conferences. You know, like you just have to look at Hyperdub to see like that there's these completely different cultural vectors that CCIU has its kind of tentacles into.
So the final point that I would like us to discuss before we let you go is to talk about By the North Sea. And yes, really, if you could just tell us what that was and tell us about what the genesis of that project is a little bit. And yes, if you could just tell us a little bit about By the North Sea, really, because it's really good. It's a fascinating and very, very, very interesting thing, which I had a wonderful time listening to when it was uploaded before it disappeared again into the ether.
Yeah, it's a strange artifact, and I don't really know quite what it is, but it's something that I've been working on for 5 years. And it is very much part of the process that I was talking about before, of kind of recollecting in every sense, like going back and trying to make sense of that period, trying to make sense of my relationship with Mark, and very immediately, it was work that came out of the need to make some kind of sense of Mark's death, or in fact, to try to make something that would put down a marker for me to go back to and recall the terrible sense of lucidity that came from knowing that Mark was gone, and that there's so many things that I had somehow imagined would happen one day that now were never going to happen. Like somehow I always had in my mind that we would together go back, kind of get back together at some point in the future and be able to form that kind of collective, productive, exciting kind of milieu again. And so the focus for that feeling became this project that Mark and I worked on briefly in 2001. And it was a project where we wanted to make a documentary. It was meant to be a documentary film about this town in Suffolk in the east of England called Dunwich, which over the centuries has kind of gradually fallen into the sea. It's part of the East Anglian coast that's being slowly eroded by the North Sea. And Mark and I had both gone there as children on holiday, and we both knew about it. And we had this idea that this story could somehow be integrated with the CCRU mythos, mainly through this one mention in the CCRU writings of the Trinitarian Church of Dagon, which is meant to be this some kind of cult that was dedicated in kind of a Lovecraft style to like bringing back the old ones and reconnecting humans with their aquatic origins, which obviously connects to like a whole series of things in the CCRU writings about the sea and water and human like regression, biological heredity, a whole kind of complex of concepts about the sea. And so the idea was to kind of weave these things together and to make this documentary film that would be kind of I guess a documentary fiction. So we actually went to Dunwich. We spent a couple of days there and we interviewed a couple of people, one guy in the museum at Dunwich and another guy who is a diver who kind of explores the ruins. There's a famous legend about Dunwich that there's like 14 churches or something under the sea there. And they say that you can hear the church bells ringing under the sea sometimes. It's got this kind of quasi-romantic image. But when you go there, there's just nothing there because it's all under the sea. It's just like a beach. And then you can walk up on the cliff. And at the time we were there in 2001, there was one gravestone left on the edge, right on the edge of the cliff, which was from the last church that fell down the cliff into the sea. And then there's like...
It is still there. Only just.
Right.
Only just.
Yeah. And then, so after we kind of started off on this project, it just never happened. And Mark and I had this weird kind of relationship where we just wouldn't talk for years on end. But as I said, like I always had the expectation that one day we'd probably finish it or we'd do something with it. And over the years, I'd gone back to it and kind of written a few treatments of the documentary, and then like a kind of fictionalized version of the trip that we made to Dunwich as well. And so in 2017, I just kind of wrote this thing that since then I've been just kind of trying to put together first as a film, and then when I realized that was insanely ambitious, just as an audio piece. And I'd kind of given up and then not given up and added bits to it over the years, and it kind of accreted. It has a lot of layers, some of which I wasn't consciously aware of, I think. So yeah, so the final to put it very briefly, the final piece is like an hour-long audio piece in which there's these different layers. So the sum of the footage from the actual trip we made to Dunwich in 2001, there's the interviews. Then there's me kind of telling the story of that from the viewpoint of 2017. Then there's like a fictionalized version of it, which involves Templeton, one of the characters from the CCRU mythos. And then kind of on the outermost or innermost shell, part of this kind of system of embedded shells, there is Echidna Stillwell, who's in correspondence with someone about Dunwich and trying to understand how this Church of Dagon fits into her inquiries about the nature of time. And at each level, what's at stake is going back to this, what I was saying about the AOE and the Lemurians. What's always at stake is the idea of finding some way of thinking time that will enable you to negotiate with finality and with the fact that something's ended, right? Like how can I understand that some things are never going to happen again? And my answer to that at the time was, I'm going to go back and like make this thing as if Mark was still doing it with me.
I guess we should say that of everything that we've discussed tonight, we will put things in the show notes. But I guess we can't put Bad North Sea in the show notes because we had it for the sort of premiere online for the 4K Bunk sort of a memorial lecture that happens at Goldsmiths every year. And I guess you've sort of decided that you want to kind of replicate that experience of a sort of specific listening that you will maybe you're planning to show it again. But is that part of that? Do you think that a way of preserving that kind of intensity that we sort of been talking about?
I mean, like this is the approach that Mark and Justin took with their amazing audio piece on Vanishing Land, which is kind of based around the same area of Suffolk. And I'm sure like the thing that Mark and I did, this abortive attempt to do this thing, was one of the precursors to that piece, I'm sure. So their attitude towards it was always like, it should be something that people are in a room together listening to, and it's an experience, a shared experience. And I kind of like that idea for By the North Sea as well. I think it was good to do it online, and it, above all, like it gave me a deadline and I actually finished it, which is an amazing feeling. Like a whole period of my life has now, I've been able to kind of let go of it. So that was great. But ideally, I'd like it to be heard in an actual place. But I'm also thinking about maybe releasing it in some other way. So yeah, for the people who would like to hear it, hopefully it won't be too long before there's an opportunity. I mean, there's a whole other discussion here that could be had about extremely online culture and what enables creative work to get done, right? Like, I feel like the demand that everything always has to be immediately available to everyone on every platform can be stifling to culture, or it can be the demand for everything always to be aired continually is a problem for me, at least. And I think part of what is interesting about CCRU is it's like people in this kind of pressure cooker environment without any contact with the outside, like brewing this stuff up over years without really letting it out. And that part of that, I think, is what produces really interesting work.
One thought on the top of my head I just want to throw out there, just on the subject of forgetting and the forgetting of the CCRU, so let me start the thought again. The thing that reminds me of is one of the principles for the creation of a magical sigil in Austin Osman Spare's system, although arguably it's Spare's / Kenneth Grant's system, because apparently Grant was the one who reminded spare of his own writings in this regard, is that once the sigil has been created, the symbol has been created and then energized, it has to be forgotten. Otherwise, it won't work. And although obviously CCRU hasn't been forgotten, it has been remembered, and indeed reconstructed in some ways. It's interesting what you're saying there. Like, after 2001 or whatever, it evaporates almost. It does sink away, and it's only now, 20 odd years later, that as I said flippantly, the TikTok witches are exploring the outer regions of human experience via the numogram now. And maybe there's something to that. Maybe CCRU as hypersigil is definitely something that's waiting to be written by someone, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of ticks in CCRU. Say that.
Well, we've been talking for quite a long time now, not far off the 2-hour mark. I think this is as good a place as any to bring this conversation to a close. Robin, thank you so much for making time for us. You have been a tremendous sport.
Am I the best guest you've ever had so far?
The very best, the very, very
Absolutely.
best.
Thanks for asking me on. It's really good to talk about all this stuff.
Where can people find you online, Robin?
At urbanomic.com and my personal website, readthis.wtf.
I think that was partly our inspiration. I think we were quite glad to have got buddieswithout.org for ours, but I think readthis.wtf may just pip the post for
sums up my achievements in life.
It's great. It's beautifully designed too. It's really worth exploring.
Yeah.
People want to go and dive into stuff.
Matt, where can people find you?
You can find me at Xenogothic on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and at xenogothic.com.
Corey, same question.
And all my links are on Twitter at CJ White.
And you can find me at Hauntonaut on Twitter. My pinned post at the moment, and I need to put this in my bio, there's a link to my blog, which I'd kind of remembered that I do have, called Hauntonautics, which I want to try and do more stuff with this year, because I've completely fallen out of the habit of writing, but I previously have been fairly good at blogging, where I, in theory, over this year, going to be putting up some wank talking about the liminal, because that's still current, isn't it?
Right? Hey,
yeah.
I really enjoyed your recent posts. Don't put yourself down too hard.
I have at least 2 more brewing, but I need to just actually sit down and finish that bit of Paul Virilio I was reading in order to make it work. So anyway, we have been the Bodies Without Organs +1. Join us next time, which again is going to be more soon. It's not going to be, we're not going to have big gaps between episodes like we did with Bodies Without Organs. It was only because of circumstances completely out of my control that we had to delay this as much as we have done. But we're going to get good tight turnarounds with this, probably, maybe. So watch this space, where we will be doing something really, really good and fun next time. I'm not going to say what. I'm going to keep it a secret. But we're going to be doing some good, fun bit of writing next week, or next month. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, listener, for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.
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 What about Children of the Stones, though?
Oh shit.
Well, that's why we're going to have you on again. We'll have you on again.